So the talk I'm going to do is really work in progress, so be indulgent. I was still doing some work until yesterday with my colleague Virginie Ravenier and Ophi Derons, and it's really based on early work that we did together with Ulf and a thesis of last year. And I think Hans will be very happy because it's the ultimate pleiotropy model. There is no sex, so it's like having one locus determining everything: habitat preference, local adaptation. So I should call this ultimate pleiotropy model. So the question I'm asking here, it's also an extension of previous work, but in a different area. Nick just told about sex, and this will be an extension in a different avenue. First question is, how do populations adapt to new environments? So I'm asking a question about evolution of the niche, starting from a locally adapted population to a given environment. And in particular, can source sink dynamics prevent diversification? Just to give you an example that we're working on in my lab, this is spider mites, it's a major pest. And let's assume as we have in my lab, this species adapted to cucumber, so it lives happily in cucumber. And now let's introduce a new host plant, like tomato. What will happen? Well, when we do this in the lab, so this is the original population, we put in a tomato. After 15 generations, we actually more than doubled fecundity. It's not just after 15 generations, we actually had to introduce several times guys from the original population, otherwise this would go extinct. So we had to try several times to have this adaptation, and in the end we managed to have a population which was able to reproduce, to live on tomato. And if you look at what happened on the original host for this new population, it has slightly lost adaptation to cucumber, goes from 4.8 to 4.6, but not much. So it doubled fecundity on tomato and slightly lost something on cucumber. But it's not well adapted yet. You can see it's quite low fecundity. And I think this is probably a more general case, that whenever you undergo a host shift, it's unlikely that you are very well adapted already to the new host. And so furthermore, the new host might be very frequent, and maybe it's a good idea to make this shift, because you will increase total population size, or it might be less frequent. Spider mites, as other organisms, might have preferences. We just heard about this with Nick. And this preference might evolve. So my question is, how will local adaptation evolve in a Leven type of model? You just heard everything about it, so that's great. I don't have to explain it again. And in a context where the new host is a sink. So I assume it's not a sink if you are adapted, but when you start, you might not be adapted at all, and so maybe it is a sink. So it's really, I relax the assumption that we usually do when we do a Leven type of model, that both habitats are saturated. And I'm not sure whether in Nick's model this was the case. I assume this was the case as well. So the only thing I'm going to do is to work on this model we worked with both previously, but by assuming I have a low fecundity. So it's a viability selection models. So of course, so this is this paper I was talking about. It was published now almost 2 years ago. And this is a summary we had this paper, where we show that, in fact, what matters for the evolution of local adaptation, as we just heard, is the strength of the trade-off being from weak or moderately strong or very strong to local adaptation to the newer habitats. We can have either fixed and unconditional habitat choice, or we can have evolution of habitat choice together with local adaptation. And the third ingredient, remember, we have no sex here, okay? So no recombination, just one locus, ultimate pleiotropy. So the idea, what we find is that if we have a weak trade-off, we have, as Nick said, we have a generalist strategy. Whereas if we have moderately strong trade-off, depending on the type of model, this is a Leven type of model we just heard, then we might have branching. If we have a Dempster type of model, we have this stability, no branching. And when you have joint evolution, we have branching. In all this situation, we never have an endpoint, which is a generalist. So basically, it confirms what we're talking about. If you have preference evolving, you just evolve preference, and you fix either one or two specialists, but you no longer are a generalist. So this life cycle, just to remind you what it is, the event type, we just heard, you assume dispersal, viability selection, local density-dependent regulation, and then you mix everything. So you have a constant contribution of habitats, which might be different. The two habitats might have different frequencies, but this constant contribution. And this can allow the maintenance of local adaptation polymorphism. This is the other major model, denser. The regulation is outside the environment. And this, so you have a different contribution of habitat, and basically you get adapted to the best habitat or the most frequent habitat. So the question I'm asking here is, what if we mix the two models? Is it possible to mix the two models? And the idea is that we start by being adapted to this blue environment. Here we have density-dependent regulation, so it's really an event type of model. But we assume we have a kind of a sink here. This is the new environment. We're not adapted here, so it's a non-regulated habitat. So we assume fecundity is constant. So we don't put selection on fecundity, we put only viability, selection and viability. So we assume the fecundity is large enough for local saturation to occur in both habitats in the presence of adaptation, either generalist or two specialist. But it's low enough for non-saturation to occur if you're not in this situation, then you have local adaptation to both, either because you have two specialists or because you have generalists. So because of low survival, saturation does not occur in the habitat to which the population is not adapted to start with. So first results, I assume a fixed habitat selection. So now first I assume we have passive dispersal or no genetic variation for habitat preference, and I just want to look at what happens in this situation. Now in the general, this is in this model. Just to remind you, we had this generalist phenotype. This is the Levin model, and this is the Dempster model. Now, there is one difference between these two models, even though both lead to one generalist. In the Levin model, the generalist only depends on habitat frequencies. It does not depend on habitat choice. The outcome is independent of habitat choice. Remember, we assume everything is saturated. Whereas in the Dempster model, we also get the generalist, but this time it's independent on habitat frequencies because we have no local density-dependent regulation. It only depends on habitat preference, which, again, here is fixed. Now, what happens when we release the assumption that both habitats are saturated? So this is the outcome at high fecundity. We have this generalist strategy. Oops. But this is when we decrease fecundity, this is what we get. We decrease fecundity, we still get this generalist strategy, but then we have intermediate generalist appearing, or quasi-specialist, and we decrease even further the fecundity. I should say this is local adaptation to habitat 2 here and 1 here. So it's the opposite, sorry. 2 here, 1 here. And this is habitat preference, fixed. So this is the direction of evolution. So when we start with a very low fecundity, if you are adapted to habitat 1 and you prefer habitat 2, that's bad luck, you go extinct. Okay, you go to the wrong habitat, you're bad, so you go extinct. This is the gray area here. If you are locally adapted to the first environment, as here, and you prefer it, you stay there. You just never, so you basically stay here or here. You never go to the generalist strategy. Even though being a generalist, you would be able to go on both habitats, you'd be happy, but you stay in your own country or you stay in your own patch, you don't go to the other hotspot. And if you start, but what you can see here is that here it's only, you always end up to the same endpoint, whereas as you decrease fecundity, the outcome depends on habitat preference, just like in the Dempster models. And it no longer depends, in fact, well, actually, this is just the same result, but for different. If you have a strong preference for the native host, you just stay locally adapted to the original host, and the only way to become a generalist if you have no choice, if you don't want to choose anything. So just to sum up this result, if you have a large fecundity, no diversification, you end up with a single generalist, and the only way you have adaptation to the new host is if you really prefer your native host or you really like the new host. But otherwise, you have generalist. Low fecundity, you no longer have generalist unless really you start with 0.50% chance of going to either habitat, and you can either weakly adapt to the new environment, or lose your adaptation to your own environment and gain adaptation to the new environment if you prefer it. So, which in a way, if we think about parapatric or allopatric variation, this means that if you have geographic variation for preference, because if you are in a single host to start with, preference might be neutral if you have a single environment. If now you introduce a second host, you might as well end up with some population by chance which will like this new host, whereas other population will retain, they will just like the new host, the earlier host. And this way you might get geographic variation for local adaptation, even though just because the fecundity is low. Whereas if fecundity was large, you would end up with a generalist. So in this way, having a lower fecundity might increase the condition, the possibility of having allopatric diversification. Now, if we have unequal frequency, I told you that in Levin's model, saturated model, what mattered was the frequencies of habitat. And indeed, if you have like 20% of the old habitat, 80% of the new habitat, then you really have, you evolve towards a specialist of the frequent habitat. If you have a high fecundity, so you end up here. Whereas, as you decrease fecundity again, then you see the arrows going to the right, when preference to habitat 2, go to the left, preference for habitat 1. Again, it depends on habitat preference and also on habitat frequency. So it's really a mixture of by just changing this parameter, this fecundity, we get a continuum of complete living models to somehow Dempster models, just in a continuous way. So if you have a large fecundity, usually you have a very frequent new environment, you will lose adaptation to the previous rare host. But if you have a low fecundity, again, you might get either here or here, depending on initial preference. So to conclude this part, under fixed habitat selection and weak trade-off, the enlarged fecundity, the outcome of the first of Levin's model only depend on habitat frequencies. But by low fecundity, you actually give a role to habitat preference in the evolution of local adaptation. And so you might get allopatric diversification more easily, because here you simply get a single generalist. If I switch to very strong trade-off, we get similar results. Just to show you this. So I hope you understood this kind of graph, because they come quite often. So remember, here it's adaptation to one environment, preference here. If we have a very strong trade-off, we get bistability, so we evolve either towards adaptation to this environment or to this environment, depending on initial frequency. Again, this is well known. So it's really and of course, it also depends on habitat frequency, but initial local adaptation is very important. So that if you start from a locally adapted population, like pepper or cucumber, I introduce tomato, I will never adapt to tomato. It's independent on habitat preference. You can see this axis here. If you're on the left here, you go to the left, right, you go to the right. Whatever, even if my beast would prefer tomato, they go like hell on tomato, they will never adapt to tomato. They will stick adaptation to cucumber. As you decrease fecundity, you can see that you increase the role of initial habitat preference, again, as in the Dempster type of model. So by decreasing fecundity, you actually give a major role to preference. And the reason why is this, is that if you change habitat preference, you actually change the level of saturation of the new habitat. So if you prefer the new habitat, which was unsaturated because you were not adapted to it, I mean, not you, but spider might, but by changing preference, they actually might saturate the new environment to the point that they're now selected to adapt locally to this new environment. Now, if we have moderate trade-off, as I told earlier, we might have branching in the Levin type of model, bistability again in Levin. Now, again, the same question. In this situation, we would have evolution of diversification under Levin's model. In a saturated models, this is here. You can see these arrows, well, you don't see it, but they go to right here and to the left here. Independent of habitat preference, independent of local adaptation, you go to this point, and then from there you diversify. Now, as you decrease fecundity, then you really lose this branching point, it's shrinking. And then again, the final outcome depends on initial adaptation and habitat preference, and you evolve to a specialist. You might prefer the other one, like if you're here, you prefer habitat 2, but bad luck, you started adapted to habitat 1, you evolve towards specialization in habitat 1. So you actually lose the potential for sympatric diversification by decreasing fecundity in this kind of situation. This is just if you have different habitat asymmetry in habitat frequencies, of course, the branching point is to the right because you have more of habitat 2, so you usually will evolve. There's a branching point still, but usually you will evolve towards specialization to this habitat. And as you decrease fecundity, you lose this branching, but you usually evolve towards the new habitat. Now, what's interesting is if you start from here, you prefer habitat 2, you are adapted to habitat 1, you evolve to a point where, or let's see here, you evolve to a point where you actually saturate both habitats. So if you're here, you're quite happy. Or here you might branch, but they continue and they specialize on your new environment. So they actually missed the opportunity for diversification. So conclusion, and the second part will be really much shorter. The conclusion with fixed habitats preference is that evolution locally leads to a single specialist in most cases when fecundity is low, even when either a generalist or a polymorphism would evolve under a large fecundity. So that's bad luck for sympatric speciation or sympatric diversification, and initial conditions are particularly important. So if fecundity is large and trade-off is strong, initial local adaptation is the important point, whereas if fecundity is low, habitat preference determines the outcome. So it's qualitatively quite different between these two situations. And I didn't show that the final population size is actually much smaller than transient size. And this is particularly true when we have the generalist strategy. If we have a low fecundity, the population would be much better off being a generalist, but it just can't evolve because the fecundity is too low. And there is actually a paper by Nuni and Pravinen which addressed the same type of question in a meta-population with local extinction. They also find that two specialists requires a large enough fecundity and moderate trade-off. But in their case, increasing fecundity or decreasing local extinction rate favor the generalist. But in a way, we also find this when we have a weak trade-off. So I think there's kind of consistent between the different models. In their model, there was no joint evolution of habitat preference. So I just will now quickly turn to the joint evolution of local adaptation and habitat preference, where we expect branching even with a weak trade-off. If we have symmetry to two equally frequent habitats, at high fecundity we have branching as in model 1, so we have sympatric diversification. As we decrease fecundity, again, we lose branching, and we evolve, as we were saying. If you let population evolve habitat preference, they will evolve in a way that matches the habitat local adaptation. So we end up with a specialist, another specialist, but you can see that the area where we have branching is really shrinking virtually to 0, and then you might have local extinction. So again, at very low fecundity, you have a single specialist. You no longer, in most cases, you no longer have sympatric diversification, and you lose the potential for sympatric speciation, but you might get allopatric diversification again. And if you have unequal habitat frequency, you completely lose even the point where you have branching, and you end up with a single specialist of the most frequent habitat. Now, if you look at this, what is really stupid is that starting from here, where you adapted to the rare habitat and you prefer it, you evolve towards this specialist, where you are locally adapted to the frequent habitat, you prefer it, even though I should have said from the beginning, I'm sorry, the pink area here is when habitat 2 is not saturated, the green one is when habitat 1 is not saturated. The white one is when both habitats are saturated. So to answer if is is natural selection adaptive here? If the idea is to maximize niche occupancy and population size, the population actually goes for a step where everything is fine, the two habitats are saturated, it has enlarged the niche, it has incorporated this new environment, and then it still evolves towards adaptation to the other environment. So we have two opposing effects of fixed versus evolving preference. At low fecundity, the evolution of habitat preference may allow population persistence. I didn't show these results actually. If we don't have, in some conditions, if we don't have evolution of habitat preference, the population might go extinct if there is a mismatch between adaptation and habitat preference. But evolution of habitat preference at low fecundity usually leads to the fixation of a single specialist with strong preference, with an overall lower population size, compared to the situation with no evolution of habitat preference. And at high fecundity, you need either polymorphism or single specialist. So general conclusion, how do populations, to answer the two questions I had to start, how do populations adapt to new environments? Well, niche conservatism is more likely if fecundity is low, unless the new environment is very abundant, and then you switch habitat. This might actually have applications to biocontrol. If you want to get rid of spider mites on cucumber, don't put tomato, which is a bad habitat. You might have, it would be better to put a new host really favorable that they like, and then they might all just switch to the new habitat. Although the spider mites don't have a low fecundity, so this was not a very good example. Can source six dynamics prevent diversification? Yes, because low fecundity decreases the chance of sympatric diversification, but because it so much depends on initial conditions and habitat choice, which might be a neutral choice initially, in fact, it might enhance allopatric diversification or parapatric diversification. And generalists are very rare endpoints. This was already a conclusion of our earlier paper. It's even more true if fecundity is low. I will not show this because I'm running short of time. And I would just like to thank the people involved. And the reason why we have not put this work, which I think we started years ago with Ulf, was that at that time all the results I presented, I got them initially using numerical simulations, and now Virginie has been able to do it analytically. So the work I presented was based on analytical work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Isabelle. And we have time for questions. Please raise your hands.
It's a bit fast.
Okay, another strong voice from the corner.
I just outstanding. That was splendid. I wonder if you ever get a result in which there is divergence, but one of the products of the divergence is generalist. So you have one specialist and one generalist. There are models in the literature which do produce that, but they're very different.
Yes, not in this model.
You know why? You have a sense of why it doesn't happen in this model.
I think if I would change the shape of the trade-off, like having a convex concave trade-off, the reason is that the trade-offs I use are very simple. They're either convex or concave, but it's easier to produce convex or concave trade-off. And I think with this situation, I would expect, just like the evolution of sex or sexual dimorphism.
That's one way. That's not the way you understood it.
No, I know, but this would be a way. In this particular model, this is how I would do it. But I haven't done it. But this, yeah, I should do it.
Further questions? Maybe I could ask one. In our previous work, we had looked not only at the Levine and Dempster model, but also at a model that was kind of in between in terms of the sequence of events. And I was wondering whether this also matters under these low fecundity assumptions. Did you already look at that?
I'm sure it does, but yes, the important point is here.
Sure enough.
Sorry, I'm sure it does.
Okay.
But I remember when we did this other, I mean, maybe I should say this other model we did, instead of having either local regulation or global regulation, The third type of model would be to have local density regulation and then viability selection after local regulation. And if you have if you have a fixed habitat choice, it's just like Dempster model. But if you have an evolving habitat preference, it's intermediate between the two. So, but it's still either soft or hard. And I presume that by changing fecundity, I would also move to a more density type model. But I haven't done it.
Okay. Anybody reconsidering the idea of asking a question?
I think they're reconsidering the idea of having a coffee.
Yeah. Indeed. Okay. Then thank you very much again, Isabelle. Very good talk.